Hi, everyone. So first of all, can you hear me? I'm a mumbler. You may have to yell at me over the course of the talk to remind me to speak up. Please don't hesitate to do so. I'm at a distinct disadvantage because I've heard my name mentioned on the stage a number of times today, but I have no idea what they were saying about me. I hope it was mostly good, and the same with whatever they had to say about Spotify. So I think we've had a pretty amazing day so far. I'm going to try to send us out right. I've learned a huge amount that I'm going to take back to some teams at Spotify. I want to start by taking a show of hands. How many of you have read Heinrich Nyberg and Anders Iverson's article about scaling Agile at Spotify, or seen them or other Agile coaches from Spotify talk? All right, so the bar for me is pretty high. Even for all of you, though, I think I can safely say that you're going to see something pretty different today. I'm the Agile lead at Spotify in New York City, where we have about 200 engineers. I'm also a member of the tribe lead team, and I'll explain what tribes are in a few minutes, for one of the tribes in New York. I'll explain all of this as we go along. But I'm also a member of the senior tech lead team for Spotify. I've been at Spotify for about 7 months. I've been around just long enough to get a good feel for how things are actually on the ground, but I don't think I've been completely indoctrinated yet. And this gives me a pretty great perspective from which to be able to talk with you all about how things really work at Spotify. So if you're one of these people like me who shows up to conferences and hears people tell tales about how awesome things are inside their company, and you're a little bit skeptical, this is the talk for you. I'm going to show you a little bit more about what actually happens inside of Spotify. This is also very much in keeping with my role at Spotify. So Agile coaches can be a lot of different things at Spotify, and my particular approach is to be really a systems engineer. My job is to help people in Spotify understand what the systems that they are building and operating in are actually like. And in particular, what are they actually optimizing for and sub-optimizing for? So in my first 7 months at Spotify, I've really spent a lot of time observing the system and talking with people about the system. And this is actually the first time I'm giving this talk, and it's actually given me a great opportunity to really encapsulate what I found so far. So before I go any further, I want to just make sure we have a level playing ground and everyone actually knows what Spotify is. So I have actually a bunch of Israeli friends that I've spent the last couple of days with, and mostly they beat me up because Spotify is not yet in Israel. It is something we're working on. For those of you who don't know, we're a streaming music service started in 2008 in Sweden by a couple of guys who didn't really like to have to make the choice between the limits imposed by iTunes and the boundless but completely illegal world of MP3 sites. Today, we're by far the largest streaming music service. We're truly global and launching in new countries almost every month. Our goal for our product, like just about everything else about our company, is to keep evolving. In the beginning, it was enough that we put nearly the world's entire published music catalog at your fingertips. Now we're focused on trying to make sure that we offer up frictionless access to the right music at the right moment for you, no matter where you are. In our vision, in the future, when you get in your car, we want you to have to push as few buttons as possible to instantly have the exact right experience for that moment, taking into account your listening habits, the time of day, maybe even something that we will eventually learn from syncing with your calendar. We want to give you the best commute or the best road trip or the best trip to your kid's sporting event. So that's really where we're trying to head as a product. I want to just quickly go over what I'm going to try to cover today. We often talk about our talks as playlists. I hope you're going to leave here today not just with a sense of how we're organized, but also how we approach our work. But really, most importantly, I hope you get a sense for what it actually feels like to work at Spotify as we scale at a truly extraordinary pace. Maybe you've heard of this thing outside of Spotify called the Spotify way. We laugh when we hear that. There is not a Spotify way. But I do want to use that framing to give you a sense of what I think Spotify actually is. I want to talk about what scaling means for us and what it feels like to be on a team that's scaling at a rapid pace, how we've organized for scaling, and a number of the challenges that we've encountered so far. I also want to give you a sense of what my observations have led me to believe is what Agile actually is at Spotify. And I'll give you a little preview. It's a lot more about culture than it is about process or even principles. I also want to end up by sharing with you an example of a key change we went through recently that I think is a great window into how scaling at Spotify is actually working. So let's talk for a minute about what we mean by scaling at Agile. So I mentioned that we were founded in 2006, but actually launched in 2008. Very quickly, and this was a big deal for a Swedish company, they scaled up to 10,000 users. Since then, just this month, we've announced that we've hit 10 million paying subscribers, and we've also just reached 40 million monthly average users. That means that we've had a 50% growth rate in monthly average users just since December of 2013. That, by the way, is twice of Twitter's current growth rate, which is a number that we like to think about. More than 5 million playlists are either created or updated every single day by users in more than 56 countries around the world. So even since I put this slide deck together, I think we launched in another country. We intend to be global. We want to be in every country in the world, and we will be in Israel sometime within probably the next year or two. The real holdouts will be China and North Korea, but we're intent on even getting there. So let's also talk about scaling the org. So today we have 600 engineers, product owners, and designers. The vast majority of those are engineers. We also have 20 or a little bit more Agile coaches working across these teams. And we've recently made our first 2 acquisitions, Tunigo and the Echo Nest. These are both companies that are helping grow our competency in music intelligence. One of the things I really want to drive home throughout the course of this talk is what scaling actually means at a human level. So these guys here, I think it's 10. I'm really bad at math, but I think there are 10 of them up there. They're part of the social team, and this is a team that I'm actually temporarily leading right now. This was the crew on the social team, or the social squad, in December of 2013, and this is them now. This is just 5 months later, and we've become much more of a super squad at this point. In particular, we've been growing our back-end capabilities so we can offer up data pipelines and APIs so that any team within Spotify can bake social functionality right into the parts of the app that they control. We've also added both a data analyst and a user researcher because the work we're doing with this team is highly experimental. We've also made the decision to develop with complete parity across all our key platforms. So when we release a feature on iOS, we want to also release it on Android and keyboard and mouse. And this is increasingly true for teams across Spotify. How many of you have encountered this environment where you're trying to keep parity across all of those platforms? It's fun, isn't it? Yeah, it's a great joy. So we've gone from 10 people 5 months ago to, I think, more than 22 today. And I'll come back to talking about what it means to be an Agile team with 22 people on it. Some of the Agilistas in the room will probably be balking at that concept. But just think for a minute about what is involved for the people on this team, what they experience when the actual team is changing so fast. You meet a new person on Monday, and by Wednesday, you're relying deeply on them to get your work done. Scaling isn't just an abstract concept for a Spotify engineer. If we get it right, we make their lives a lot better. If we get it wrong, they probably won't be a Spotify engineer for very long. So I'll come back to talking more about the team experience, but I want to talk about the notion of a Spotify way. What I'd argue is that there are actually a bunch of Spotify ways. When we go to conferences or have people contact us asking to visit, which you guys are welcome to visit, we have offices around the world. The largest are in New York and Stockholm, and we welcome people to come see us. You can just reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. But when we have those conversations, people often talk to us about the Spotify way, and they want to learn how to execute it. My message to you today is be careful what you wish for. This is what Spotify actually is. It's a collection of all of these things. And some of these things are the kinds of things that you don't actually tend to admit in a situation like at a conference, right? So let's see. One of the things that has really jumped out at me at Spotify is how much we are really a mix of a Swedish and an American company. So we have this very collectivist attitude. We are a very consensus-based organization. I think that's pretty clearly from the Swedish side of the company. But we're also hyper-competitive. We're extremely entrepreneurial. We want to win, and we talk about winning. I liked what Dean had to say earlier about winning. We all want to be on winning teams. You don't work at Spotify if you don't want to win. So we're a great mix of those things. Our founding story, how we got started, the fact that the engineer who wrote the first line of code in Spotify still works at Spotify is a big part of who we are. The fact that we managed to get these extraordinary licenses out of people like Sony and Time Warner, mostly because the guy who was charged with trying to get the licenses came from the backwoods of Sweden and didn't know how hard it was supposed to be. So he just started calling people until he got the right people and they agreed to give us some licenses. The words we use and the words that we don't use. So in my 7 months at Spotify, I think I have literally never once seen anyone try to blame anyone else for anything that has happened. That's pretty extraordinary. So sometimes we'll talk about someone that's struggling, but we talk about them in terms of how we can help them and what we can do to build a better system that's going to support them. We don't talk about laying blame on them. So the dollar sign probably sticks out there. So this is something that I don't think many companies want to talk about. Dean actually touched on this a little bit earlier. Spotify is a great product. It's really fun to work on a product where your friends tell you how much they love your product. And it's great to work on a product that you actually love to use your product. It also means that we've had access to some pretty extraordinary investors who are willing to take a really long view. In short, we have a lot of cash on hand. We also have shockingly good revenue, despite what you might read in the press. We have great revenue, we have great investors, we have a lot of cash on hand. That means that we can choose to optimize for things other than short-term efficiency. We don't have to deliver aggressively to hit specific marks. We're in it to win in the long run. We believe that streaming music will be a winner-take-all market, just like Facebook has existed in a winner-take-all market, and Google in search. We think streaming music will be the same. And we're investing in the long run for that. And that means all sorts of things for the kind of behavior that we can engage in. So the message I'm trying to drive home, our organizational structure, which I am going to talk about in a few minutes, isn't how we got to be where we are. We arrived at our organizational structure because of a ton of factors that add up to make who we actually are. I'll touch on a lot of these factors throughout the course of the talk, but I did want to point out that this is a pretty classic example of the experience of Spotify. So have people seen these before? Not surprisingly, you've all has. So we have these all over Spotify. In fact, in the tribe that I'm working with right now, when you walk, I'm a little nervous about this actually. When you walk in, the first thing you see on a huge wall is fail walls. So what we do is encourage people to actually tell the stories of failures, make them very public. It ends up taking the teeth out of them, and it makes it much easier for us to learn from those experiences. But to actually be a company where people talk about celebrating failure in the Agile community. I'm not so much into celebrating failure, but I am really into learning from it and seeing what we can apply the next time we do something. And this is an example of the kind of thing that is really culturally baked in at Spotify. So the message I'm trying to get across here, you can have the best organizational structure in the world. You can have the best tools. You can even hire the best people. But your culture and your outcomes will be a function of everything from the product you make, the customers you seek, the way your senior people behave when things are going great or when things are getting tough, and whether you're operating under conditions of scarcity or plenty. To pretend otherwise is too dangerous, and to seek to adopt principles or practices that work well for other companies given their basket of conditions is risky business, particularly if you don't spend time exploring what the underlying conditions are for those organizations and comparing them to your own. So one great way I like to investigate what a company is actually like is to investigate how the company spends its time and its money. And that usually translates into what people spend their time doing. So I went back through my calendar for just the last 2 weeks, and I wanted to pull out some of the things that represent what I've spent some of my time on. The first one there was actually really fun. So I spent a day at an offsite in Stockholm with our entire senior tech leadership team talking about the pros and cons of the organizational structure, the tribes, chapters, and squads that I'm going to talk to you about in a few minutes. And my job, what I was tasked by the CTO with doing, was showing up and saying everything bad I could come up with about this organizational structure. So I got to spend a few weeks going around the company and gathering exclusively negative feedback. Has anyone here encountered the concept of ritual dissent? So this is basically ritual dissent, me yelling at the tribe leads, the people who designed this system, so that they could figure out, is it time for us to change? Is it, or are there things that we need to do to strengthen this system? One of the things that came out of that meeting is that we don't have enough career growth opportunities for technical people who don't want to be on a managerial track. So immediately after the meeting, we started going into gang writing a Google Doc, which is something we do often, to establish new roles. 2 weeks later, people are already being offered experimental positions that emerged out of that process, and I got to be part of that as well. It's loop season at Spotify right now, which is our version of 360-degree reviews. You don't have to do loops, so you don't have to actually ask for any loops if you don't want to. If you do, you invite whoever you want to give you feedback. Feedback can be signed or anonymous. And you choose who sees loops that others write for you. So if I don't want my manager to see my loops, they'll never see them. Last week, I wrote loops for 2 of my counterparts, both of whom had also recently provided me with some feedback. And in fact, both of them had provided me some pretty strong improvement opportunities, which I actually hugely appreciated. So that in turn caused me to be really careful with what feedback I provided them in their loops. Another topic I'll come back to later in this talk is the struggles we've had around executing large cross-org projects well. Our focus on autonomous teams and skepticism of anything that looks like top-down management have caused us to avoid developing a strong project management practice inside the company. And that's something that a bunch of us feel really needs to be addressed. I've been working with a self-selected group of individuals who are putting together a proposal for how we might handle large-scale projects in the future. And over the last 2 weeks, I've spent actually a good deal of time in meetings with them and reviewing material they've produced. So maybe given my role at Spotify, it's not that surprising that these are the kinds of things I'm spending my time on. But maybe what is surprising is that Spotify thinks that it's important to have people in the organization who spend a good deal of time on problems like this. I personally like to be really involved in shipping software. So I spend about 50% of my time working directly with teams. But if I wanted to, and I could prove the value to Spotify, it would be no problem for me to spend most of my time on org improvements. That really is a central piece of how we're scaling without losing who we are. So not only do we have 20 Agile coaches who are moving throughout the company focused on these kinds of problems, we also have an org inside the company called POPs, or People Operations, and their tagline is HR that doesn't suck. It sometimes puts them in conflict with our HR department. But a big part of what they're doing is making sure that we're actually building the organization we want to build to produce the results that we want to produce. All right, so I've talked a lot about the softer stuff. Thanks for bearing with me, particularly if you came to hear mostly about what are in the articles that you might have read. So let's start talking about the organizational structure that acts as a scaling framework for us. So in the early days, Spotify was like many other software companies. A few engineers built everything. We started growing fairly immediately, and by 2012, it had become pretty obvious that we needed a way to spin up new teams quickly. And we needed a structure that would allow us to do that with as little friction as possible. The people who led this effort, which included Oscar Stahl, our CTO, Anders Iverson, who's one of our Agile coaches, and Karin Bjorken, who's now head of People Operations, and Heinrich Nyberg, who many of you know is one of the major thinkers in the Lean Kanban movement, and Scrum and Agile before that. They also wanted to optimize for letting people move around pretty easily throughout the org, so retention is very, very important at Spotify, and that means that
if you get bored of what you're doing after 6 months or a year or 2 years, we want to make it very easy for you to stay in the company and go find another problem that you're interested in working on. And finally, we wanted to make sure that we balanced a strong focus on delivering value with making sure that we gave people room for personal and professional growth. Here's a review of the structure that they came up with, most of which still is pretty much in place now, 2 years later. So for an engineer, the center of your life at Spotify is your squad. And I've asked, why do we call it squads and not teams? Because I'm actually usually pretty suspect of coming up with fancy names to describe things that already have names. And the answer is that we have so many different types of teams at Spotify, and I'll share some of this with you, that it actually just got practically confusing for people to talk about teams because no one knew which type of team you were talking about. So in your squad, you likely have a few back-end devs, a few front-end devs, a designer, a QA person or two. You might have a full-time Agile coach. You might have an Agile coach who comes in when you pull them or comes in and does regular checkups with you. There's a PO who's a full member of the team, sits with the team, goes to lunch with the team, thinks of themselves as a member of the team. And there might be, as I mentioned in the case of social, and this is increasingly the case, a data analyst or a user researcher or both. From an execution standpoint, we want squads to be as autonomous as possible. Product owners generally set the direction for a squad, but usually with a great deal of input and engagement from the team, as well as in concert with the larger product organization. Tech and prod are actually separate organizations at Spotify. Throughout the org, you'll find partnerships that generally consist of a tech rep, a product rep, a design rep, and often an Agile coach. So this is very much true at the squad level. As a member of a squad, you work in a squad room, and your squad room looks very similar to this no matter what office you're in. Because one of the things we want to do is constantly lower friction for people moving around. So whether you're working at a desk in New York, or a desk in Stockholm, or a desk in London, or a desk in Gothenburg, or a desk in Paris, literally the desk is going to be the same. There are those kinds of desks that you can raise or lower. And the setting that you're in is going to be the same, because we want you to be able to move pretty seamlessly across those experiences. Squad rooms have whiteboards everywhere. They tend to have little breakout rooms that are big enough for private one-on-ones, an area with comfortable chairs so you can have a more relaxed conversation. Most squads don't have an identified leader, although a few squads do. The squad is responsible for its own performance. Being a member of a squad can be pretty awesome because you have more control over your work than you might encounter just about anywhere else. But at its worst, it can actually feel sort of isolating, and you can even feel a little bit abandoned, because sometimes the organization's attention is really elsewhere, and you're just supposed to sort of keep hitting your marks independently and autonomously, and sooner or later someone will come pay attention to what you're up to and reintegrate you back into the whole. In terms of day-to-day operations, squads have a great leeway in the tools they use. They have great leeway in the practices they use, and I'll come back to that. For almost everything you can think of, whether it's a code repository or a build server, a Kanban tool, or a group chat tool, most teams are using one of 2 to 4 common options, but some teams are sometimes testing something at the edges with some new tool. So for the more technically minded above you, you heard me say that our teams use different code repositories, right? And different build tools. Does this sound like fun to you? So it's fun some of the times, and it's a huge pain in the ass other times. It can feel amazing to get to pick your own tools and get to experiment, and it's one of the things that has helped keep our retention rate at Spotify like 95%. If you want to go play with the newest thing, all you got to do is convince your team, and you get to go off and play. But it can also be pretty frustrating because sometimes you simply can't interface easily with other squads because they're working so differently. I personally find it incredibly challenging that all our teams use different group chat tools. So some teams use IRC, some teams use HipChat, some teams use Campfire. They can't figure out how to talk to each other half the time. This points back to a common refrain both in this talk and at Spotify, the relationship between autonomy and alignment. We've traditionally indexed heavily in favor of team autonomy, sometimes at the cost of overall alignment. I'll talk about that more as we keep going. So one thing I'll say, though, is that autonomy isn't just about getting to do what you want. It also comes with a ton of collective responsibility at the team level. Squads are responsible for maintaining their own services and data pipelines in a condition so that other squads can make use of them with high expectations around performance and uptime. So if you put a data pipeline or a service into production, it's the expectation that other teams can use it and that you're keeping it in a malleable, strong, resilient state. Over the last year, we've been rolling out an Ops and Squads initiative, which is shifting most operational responsibilities back into the squads. That means they're responsible for provisioning their own hardware. It means they're responsible for maintaining their own systems, establishing their own monitoring, and responding to emergent issues when the system goes down. So when something goes down in the social group and I'm on rotation, I get a call. Excuse me, while our operations guys sleep happily in their beds. From a less technical perspective, squads are also responsible for making sure that their missions and how they're approaching their missions are well known and understood throughout the org so they can maximize impact, but also so we can try to avoid redundancy. One other thing I'll note that that we're learning is that some of our lower level missions are actually broad enough that they warrant something larger than a single squad. And that's the case with the social team that I showed you earlier. These teams are basically now forming and reforming constantly into sub-squads. So the 22 people on the social team might be today broken up into 5 teams of 2. The next day, they might be, I'm really bad at math, they might be 4 teams of 5. We think that these guys need to be very closely aligned, so they tend to do things like have whole group meetings on Mondays and Fridays, but their stand-ups are in sub-squad days on the days in between that. This is something we're playing around with. There are actually a number of squads that have moved in this direction. Another pattern that's emerged is teams that are breaking up into infra and feature squads. So as we do more and more platform building, so building out tools that anyone in the company can use, we have more and more teams breaking up into people who are focused on building out those teams, the APIs, the data pipelines, and teams that are focused on making use of those resources. This is not perfectly aligned with Agile's way of thinking around standard feature teams, you'd probably notice, but we're open to experimentation and we'll see where it goes. As a member of a squad, you're also a member of something we call a chapter. A chapter is generally a group of 5 to 15 people who share a skill set, and they also share a manager who is a respected practitioner in that skill area. So if you're a back-end engineer, your chapter is made up of back-end engineers from anywhere between 2 to 10 other squads from your own, and your manager is almost certainly an active back-end engineer themselves. We call these people chapter leads. Many chapter leads spend about half their time working directly with the team as a contributing member, though they may have some organic authority on that team by virtue of their technical seniority. They generally don't have any managerial role on the team they're working with, though there are both intentional and unintentional exceptions to this. So sometimes we'll ask a chapter lead to take a stronger role, but sometimes a chapter lead will just sort of acting like a boss in a team, and then usually an Agile coach shows up and tries to flatten that organization back out. At its best, being a member of a chapter means being part of a team that's not only focused on delivery, but actually cares about helping you grow while ensuring that you have the best possible environment in which to do so. At its worst, being a member of a chapter can feel like you're being pulled in a bunch of different directions. Your squad might want you to be focused on one thing, your chapter might want you to focus on another thing. I mentioned why we had to come up with the term squads. That's because your chapter is a team and your squad is a team. Your chapter lead might do an awesome job of staying up on what's happening in your day-to-day work, and they might show up to really help you, pair with you in solving some of your problems. Or they might be largely absent for a while and focusing elsewhere, unable to give you practical guidance around the problems you're facing. Does anyone recognize what the real world calls the model I just described to you? Sorry? Professional management, or a matrixed organization, right? So we face all the same problems that a standard matrix organization face, although we're probably a little bit more intentional and really focused on deciding where we're going to tweak things to optimize in one direction or another. I think I'm probably not supposed to say that we're a matrixed organization, so don't tweet that. The next component of our structure is a tribe. A tribe is simply a collection of squads that usually share a broader mission. So for example, if you're in the SRE squad, you're part of our infrastructure and operations tribe, or IO for short. Some tribes are more geographically than mission bound. In fact, if you've seen an earlier version of this presentation, we actually used to have a rule that tribes had to be physically co-located, but we're actually finding that mission clarity trumps geography, so we increasingly have tribes that span our global offices. Tribes are made up of anywhere from 5 to 20 squads. There are currently something like 7 tribes, but this could change in the time I'm giving this talk. Tribes tend to be led by a team that reflects the same structure as squads, with a tribe lead who has a technical background, a product owner, a design partner, and an agile coach chapter lead rounding out the group. One way we talk about tribes is as incubators. The tribe leadership is responsible for making certain that squads have the resources, information, and infrastructure that they need to be successful. This includes things like overseeing the recruiting function for the squads, as well as managing physical spaces, budgets, those kinds of things. Tribes are generally kept well below Dunbar's number, or the outer limit of the number of people who you can sustain real social relationships with. That means most tribes stand between 70 and 120 people, though some are smaller and some are larger. Another way we build relationships throughout the org is through the concept of guilds. Guilds are self-organizing communities of interest. There's a back-end guild, there's a front-end guild, there's an agile guild, but there are also many language-specific guilds. There's a project management guild, there's a CI/CD guild. Guilds can be lightweight as a mailing list, or as substantial as a group that organizes trainings and even unconferences. Our data guild recently held an unconference that was attended by nearly 100 people in New York City. Guilds tend to gain steam when they're facing really interesting problems and lose steam if there isn't a really useful thing for them to help solve inside the organization. So that's our org structure. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we operate within that org structure in terms of sort of traditional agile methodologies. So one thing that I can say that we definitely have in common with Dean and the SAFE model is that we are agnostic in the method wars. The answer to this question is basically this. In its early years, Spotify was very much a Scrum shop. In fact, we had 3-week release cycles across the entire company, completely synced. Over time, we found that that just didn't give us the flexibility that we needed, and teams began experimenting with different things. For all I know, there might even be someone doing RUP somewhere on Spotify, and I'm certain there are people doing Waterfall. The fact is, a team does whatever works, and really our only expectation is that what they're doing works for them. There are coaches who are charged with sometimes stepping in to help make sure a team is productive and happy, but we don't impose principles and practices in any case except for the most immature teams or teams that are really suffering. And then we tend to treat those things as scaffolding that we try to remove as quickly as possible once the team has their feet under it. We are looking mostly for healthy, productive teams with clear missions. Where we find them, we generally aren't concerned with the mechanics they are using to get the job done. This leads me to my next point, which is what do we really mean by Agile at Spotify? So this talk is on scaling Agile, right? The answer I've been able to find is pretty much that. At Spotify, we have a real commitment to finding better ways to work. For us, that usually means having a healthy mix between things that make us productive, happy, and likely to deliver the right things to customers at the right time. When I first got to Spotify, in fact, I was a bit shocked at the range of levels of adoption of Agile and XP practices. We don't have broad adoption of world-class test coverage. We don't do TDD in most cases, or BDD. Pairing is usually pretty informal and haphazard. Teams are doing Kanban, but not necessarily explicitly limiting their WIP. Our continuous integration and continuous deployment capabilities have actually made great strides in recent months because we've decided that we want to focus on them, but they're nowhere near where they need to be. In fact, if you came in and did a pure Agile adoption review inside Spotify, you'd say we're pretty weak in many of the factors that are generally considered the hallmarks of Agile. Having said that, though, I've come to believe we're actually are pretty incredibly Agile in the ways that really matter. It's kind of cool in some quarters these days to dismiss the Agile Manifesto, but I think at its heart was pretty much in the right place. It recognizes that people are more important than rules, that you learn a lot more from exploring working software than you do from developing requirements docs, that you need to build what your customers actually are demanding from you. And that maybe above all, you must be able to respond to change. And in each one of those areas, I think Spotify is actually incredibly strong. So I want to go through an example of a recent, fairly aggressive and really all-encompassing change that Spotify went through. So how many of you know Conway's law? So in software development, we read this to mean that if you look at a company's software, it's very likely that you can identify their org structure. We tend to build our org structure into our product. Mel Conway would have been extremely happy with Spotify as an example of his system. If you look at the left sidebar there, there was a time when each one of those things on the left-hand side were basically a squad or a tribe. So when we decided we wanted to solve a new problem, we just add another tab into our left-hand navigation. This, over time, made for a pretty crappy user experience, let alone the problems that it created for us in just trying to manage our system. Each one of those sections also had not just a different tab, but completely different user interactions inside the system, different buttons to do the same thing, different workflows to accomplish the same task. And it got worse when you looked out across the platforms that we implement on. So if you were one of these people who for some reason used us on an Android and an iOS device, you would have been forgiven for thinking that you were actually using different companies' software as you moved from one product to the other. And it got even worse when you looked at our keyboard and mouse, our web and our desktop players. As a user, not an employee at Spotify, I, like many in the media, had begun to really notice this. In 2013, there were a lot of people in the media talking about this problem, and a lot of my friends who were users were talking about this problem. So this is how I describe how change happens at Spotify. We talk a lot. We are a consensus culture. So when we decided that we wanted to tackle this problem, my guess is that that line probably started sometime in 2011, or maybe early 2012. And it might have started with 2 people talking about this problem. And then as the reality that we needed to address it gained steam, one of the things that happens is the problem gains more people. So first 2 people are interested in the problem, and then 4 people, and then 5 people, and then 20 people, and then 70 people. Living inside this can be pretty frustrating. Again, we are not optimized for speed. We are optimized for something that some of us call anti-fragility. We learn from being harmed. So conversation, but here's an interesting thing that happens. We pretty much always hit an inflection point. I don't know of a single major serious business problem facing Spotify that this hasn't been the case. We hit an inflection point where we've reached consensus, and then we execute, and we execute incredibly quickly. So we might have been talking about this problem for 2 years, but we solved it across all our products in a matter of just a few months, which is actually pretty striking. And I think in many ways is better than the pattern that you might experience in a more traditional organization. Still, living through that stuff leading up to that, it can be pretty painful. This is what we ended up with. If you, I've heard that, I won't report this back home, but I've heard that a fair number of Israelis VPN into other locations to access Spotify, so it's possible that you've actually seen this interface. To get there involved more than 20 teams, it involved more than 100 people, and actually from the moment that they started ideation to delivery out in the field was about 8 months. And this itself was not an easy experience to live through. We experienced late nights, we experienced long weekends, and these are things that we usually don't do at Spotify. And we even did something we almost never do at Spotify. We made a deadline because we wanted to have a big product launch. So we made a deadline, which we never do at Spotify, and then we broke the deadline, which we never do at Spotify. And these were pretty traumatic experiences for us. What I think is great, though, about Spotify is that we extracted a huge amount of learning from this experience. We've done whole group retros, lots of teams and sub-teams have done retros. We've baked in a lot of change. This ranges from the technical, so one of the things we did as a result of this project is we took Twitter Bootstrap and we modified it into our own version that we call Glue. Glue now solves 80% of the user experience problems that an engineer will encounter. That means our engineers no longer have to make up their own buttons to solve problems. And it means they get to spend most of their energy solving really interesting problems that we haven't solved before. So that's a sort of technical response that came out of this project. On the other hand, it also really made us start thinking about this autonomy and alignment concept. So for most of its time, Spotify talked and acted like what we really valued was alignment, and as if alignment and autonomy are polar opposites, and you have to pick one or the other. But by the time I got to Spotify, people were already getting pretty uncomfortable with the results it was producing for us to be so aligned, so aligned towards autonomy. This is where our discussion has really taken us, and interestingly, if you read Heinrich's article, I think he had a version of this image there. So we've been talking about this for a long time. But what the CAP project caused us to really have to do, because we'd never done a project of this scale before across so much of the organization, it really caused us to start to figure out what are we going to do to try to balance alignment and autonomy. I would not say that we are anywhere near having figured it out, but I would say that we have very much adjusted our thinking. So one of the big things we've done recently is you will start to see portfolio Kanbans popping up around the organization. So at the tribe level, the tribe that I work with has a portfolio Kanban, and a number of other tribes adopted that. And now the tribe leadership, the senior lead team, also has a portfolio Kanban. These are concepts, as simple as they are, that would have seemed really anathema to Spotify even 6 or 8 months ago. The trick now is for us to keep figuring out how to stay true to the intent of autonomy while finding ways to make sure we use autonomy to tackle the tough, fun, and interesting problems, and using alignment to make sure we're headed in the right direction and not wasting our time on boring problems or problems that we've already solved. Having said that, we remain pretty skeptical about how much uniformity you can effectively impose on squads made up of very different people with very different missions. So we want our teams to still have a great deal of control over what they work on and how they work. So if you've taken any lesson away from what I've talked about today, I think I've probably used up my time. I don't want it to be that Spotify it does this way, so we're going to go home and try to copy that. I hope that you've taken away, what you've taken away is a story about a company that invests heavily in supporting an agile culture, one that makes conscious choices about what to optimize and what gets de-optimized along the way. I hope you've also gotten a sense of what it's really like to be inside of Spotify. Lastly, I hope you've gotten a sense of how even a professional skeptic like me could come to love a place like Spotify. How many companies are going to pay me to fly halfway around the world to tell you everything that is wrong in the company that writes my paycheck? That's a pretty extraordinary thing. Some things I'd ask you to consider when you're optimizing a system for certain behaviors and outcomes, you are sure to be de-optimizing it or sub-optimizing it for other things. So be really conscious of that in your work. In most companies, a problem emerges and it can get pushed under the rug. If you're seeing those kinds of things, then you want to figure out how to change your organization to address that kind of behavior. If what you need to optimize for is, as I think Dean said today, really efficient throughput, value through your system, if that's the critical thing you're optimizing for, you're going to organize one way. If you are optimizing for making a happy home for your engineers, which is something that's a great concern to Spotify, you'll optimize a different way. What we really argue for is very conscious decision making, and I hope that that's what you took away from this talk. Thank you.
Any time for questions? Any questions? Sorry? Deal with integration? So one of the key answers to that is that engineers talk to engineers. So we are pretty allergic to proxying. So we don't have an engineering team talk to a PO who then goes talks to another PO who talks to an engineer. If an engineer is having an integration issue or knows that they have a key integration coming up, they reach out to an engineer on the team that they want to integrate with, and they figure out together how they're going to solve that problem. Does that? Other questions?
You said earlier that you have HR that doesn't suck.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Okay. So one of the things that people operations does is they're just present. So they're there when we go through our objectives and key results process, which is how we set goals at the squad level. They're there when we're doing portfolio planning. They're there when a team member is really struggling. And their job is to keep us healthy and happy. That's really their whole remit. So standard HR has all sorts of other problems, right? They're worried about liability, they're worried about healthcare, they've got all these concerns. These guys' job, their only job is to make sure that we're healthy and happy. And how they do it is by being present where the work is happening and injecting themselves or being available to be pulled in when they see something that they can help with.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about the product owner synchronization? You have chapters for the technical guys.
Yep.
You have the same thing with the product owner.
Excellent, yep. So we've actually made some recent changes in this process. So our product organization is actually incredibly flat. So our head of product is a guy named Gustav Soderstrom. Under Gustav are maybe 3 or 4, maybe up to 5 now, what we call product area leads. And we've divided the product areas up in terms of almost use cases. So one product area is called what to play. And everyone involved in that product area is contributing to making it incredibly easy for the user to show up in our software in any context and immediately find some music that they want to do. And interestingly, the product areas don't match up to squads or tribes, because you might solve that problem in this tribe over here in 1 minute and this tribe over here in another minute. So you've got the product area leads who, among other things, go around and evangelize to tribes and squads about things that they want to see happen in the product. And then you've got this other layer, which is product owners who mostly report up to 2 people who report to Gustav. And product owners are just dispersed members of teams. And I'd say that they spend maybe 80% of their time with the team and 20% of their time engaging with other product owners. One of the most extraordinary things that I've experienced at Spotify is something we do every single quarter called Product Days. Product Days is 2 days. Every product owner in the company and anyone who else wants to come can come hear what's happening in our product operation. It's a really extraordinarily powerful thing. We also videotape it. You can watch it. And we also have an internal comms team, and their job is to pull out some of the most interesting things from those and lots of other communications. Does that speak to your question, Yvonne?
So we've been in the discussion, and there were a lot of discussions about safety today.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you can crystallize for us what is different between the way it looks like in Spotify right now and how people that would go and do safe
Yep.
do it. I mean, it's obviously different from the culture and how
Sure.
the practices.
Yep, so the question is sort of what are the practical differences between our approach and SAFE? I'll give a little bit of a sideways answer. So first of all, Dean talked today about the method wars. So I come mostly from the lean Kanban community, and that is a community that is unfortunately overly interested in the method wars from my perspective. So I haven't been exposed to SAFE in practice. I've been exposed to a lot of my peers in the lean Kanban community who have a lot of things to say about SAFE.
but I haven't experienced in practice, and I was actually really excited to hear Dean's talk today. So most of what I know from what I heard today, and some things that I've read. And I'd say a couple of things. So you heard me talk a huge amount about the underlying culture of Spotify, and a lot of that just is. It's not stuff that people, the most basic stuff just is. It's not really stuff that we indexed for. Now we're sophisticated enough that we try to index for a certain kind of culture, but that isn't where we started out. I didn't see a lot of talk about unique cultures in Dean's talk. That doesn't mean that SAFE doesn't speak to it, but it really isn't a starting point from what I could tell, and I'd say that that's a pretty big difference. I think also, the other thing that really struck me is that SAFE, I think, is pretty comfortable with prescribing certain behaviors in certain areas, and I'd say Spotify is much less comfortable. We're highly allergic to prescribing any behaviors or any protocols or any processes. My own opinion is somewhere in the middle, and my own opinion is that everything is contextual. So if you're in an organization in which what you value is mostly sustaining innovation, so making incremental improvements to your product, and in particular, if what you're really doing is responding to pull demand from your customers, so you've got a large customer base, and it's relatively easy to find the signal about what they really want, and sort of all you need to do is keep making sure that you build the next thing they want, then a more prescriptive environment makes a ton of sense. Spotify is intentionally hiring for something called distributed cognition. We think that the space we move in changes overnight, and I mean overnight. So Spotify was a different company a month, don't tweet this, I'll get killed for saying this. Spotify was a different company a month ago than it is today. Does anyone know what happened the last month that could have changed who we are? Little rumor that maybe Apple, the most capital-rich company in the world, is going to buy a little company called Beats. We have to be able to change overnight to address a problem like that. And a story, I told this to someone earlier today, like a guiding story for me is WhatsApp. So you guys know the WhatsApp, I think a lot of Israelis use WhatsApp, right? You guys know the product. So you guys know that the guy who developed WhatsApp, in 2008, he went to Facebook, and he went through their interview process, and he failed. They didn't hire him. And then he went to Twitter, and he went through their interview process, and he failed. They didn't hire him. So he's like, well, what the fuck else am I going to do? And he went and built WhatsApp. And then he sold it to Facebook for $19 billion. Spotify wants to be the company where that guy gets hired and builds WhatsApp for us. And you build a different kind of company if that's what you're indexing for. So I didn't hear a ton in what Dean was talking about that is particularly indexed for making sure that really big ideas could emerge from any corner of the business and turn into the next $20 billion idea. Spotify is indexing for that. And that's how I think we're different. But that's in no way to take away from, that's all about our context. There are lots of other contexts where you want to index for very different things. Other questions? Yep. Not that well. That's the honest answer. I think we're getting better and better at it. So one of the things that is happening is that sort of the Kanban phase visualization and the concept of whip limiting have become a more universal language in the company. So even teams that are mostly doing Scrum are very likely to have a Kanban visualization. And as I mentioned, through no particular fiat, no governance decision, portfolio Kanbans are showing up more and more throughout the organization. So this is the way things usually happen at Spotify. Something hurts enough that a problem emerges, and we're willing to adopt it. And I actually think it's a pretty healthy model, but it can be an interesting thing to live through. Other questions?
Would it be safe to say that the product area leaders don't really instruct the squads what to take up and what to do and what not? And
the word I'd use is lobby. So mostly product area leads really need to make the case for what they want to have happen and find teams that agree. So a perfect example, I'm working right now with the product area lead for social. And he's really selling this idea that social features should be wherever you are in the app, where your experience would be enhanced by knowing something about how your friends are listening to and engaging with music. Spotify. Yes, he's right. That's why I'm working with him, right? He's got to go around and pitch teams. So he wants to put functionality in genres so that when you go to hip hop, you find out that this friend is building awesome hip hop playlists, and that makes you follow them, and it makes you engage more deeply with them inside Spotify, and it points you to new music that they're listening to that you didn't know about. He's got to go to that team, and he's got to convince them to try to do some experiments with that functionality. Other questions? Great, thank you guys so much.